Greetings and welcome to episode 4. I said it was episode 4 last time. It really wasn't, it was episode 3. So this is episode 4 of A Journey. We're reading from the book A Journey, and we're here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest once again in our home. And I've got Rook, our good dog, here with me. Rook and I, by the way, yesterday found a new trail in the woods. We've been, especially the last year, trying to spend as much time as we can walking in the woods. And what a great thing. She's 13, and, it makes me almost pick her up to put her in the car to go. But when we get there, she just leaps and jumps and runs back and forth on the trails. It's just a wonderful place for her. And I had a hip replacement a little bit ago, so it's great to be out walking in the woods. Very therapeutic. If you have a dog and if you have woods, you should walk in them. What else is new? Oh, let's see. Tomorrow, my wife and I are going to see Santana and the Doobie Brothers, a concert. That should be fun. I'm looking forward to that. And what else did I want to mention? Yes, last time when we read, I mentioned that my brother Pat had sailed from England to Barbados on this old sailboat that was built, I said, in the 1900s. What I meant to say in what's written in the book is the early 1900s. It was a really old sailboat and had a grand piano on board as well. So we'll clear that up. I'm sure there'll be lots more times that I'll read something wrong and then I can clear it up the next time, though. So that's a bonus. But today we're reading from chapter 6, and this is entitled Emerald Isle. Journal entry, Monday, 7/5. Today Rod and I left Sammy and Mays and have now gone our separate ways. He is headed for Great Yarmouth and is then going to the continent, and I headed off for Stranraer. Great Yarmouth is a seaside resort town on the east coast of England, and Stranraer is a port town in southwest Scotland from where I would be taking the ferry to Larne, Northern Ireland. I got very many really nice rides, one by a lady whose son is going to travel Europe, another by a man who owns 7 shoe stores, one quite long ride by a very nice guy who bought me a cold drink at a service stop, and the last, just a few exits by a young guy. After the last ride, I walked up to a house and asked if a nearby town had accommodations. I am now camping in their field. I spent the evening watching Bonnie and Clyde in their house. I can't believe how fantastic people can be. After a couple days and several rides, the last one being a commercial truck that brought me over 100 miles, I arrived in Stranraer and was able to catch a boat to the Emerald Isle. That first night in Northern Ireland, I spent camping in a field in the seaport town of Larne. The year 1976 would prove to be an incredibly violent year in Northern Ireland, with nearly 300 deaths due to the Troubles, and over 200 of those killed being civilians. I must admit that I arrived in Ireland without a clear understanding of just what was really behind this violence. I had hoped that after spending some time traveling throughout both North and South, I would have a better handle on what was actually going on. The truth is, even after nearly 2 months, I never did. From Larne, I was able to hitch a ride from a nice gentleman in a dairy truck. Riding in the milk truck brought back great memories of my youth when Marty the milkman would sometimes give me a ride in his truck from our house up the gravel road to the mailbox. As I recall, however, Marty and I never did discuss religion during our short ride up the bumpy gravel road. One of the first questions that the kindly Irish milkman asked during our trip was whether I was Catholic or Protestant. Although I had grown up in a Baptist church, I'd never given a lot of thought about being a Protestant or a Catholic. Truth is, I simply considered myself a believer in Jesus. That's what I told Mr. Milkman. I'm just a believer. Thankfully, this answer was enough to satisfy his question, and we went on to talk about some simpler things. My lift from the kindly milkman ended in the village of Ballymena, where I hoped to make contact with another wonderful relative, Cousin George. George was married to Sadie, sister to Em and May, my delightful motherly cousins in England. Ballymena was at that time a town where coal was converted to gas at the gas works and where Cousin George was employed. Before trying to get in touch with George, I first made a stop at the logical place to pause when arriving in a new Irish village, the pub. While at the public house, I met a guy named Pete. Pete was careful to point out a small group of long-haired gentlemen who were playing pool, one of which, according to Pete, was a really bad guy. Wouldn't you know it? It wasn't long before Matt, the really bad guy, and his friends had invited me over to play pool and were buying me pints and sandwiches. No question about it, Matt was an interesting character. He told me how he and his mates would load up into a van and go down south for a good punch-up. When I asked him why he would do this, Matt gave a lame excuse about disliking Catholics because they prayed through a priest instead of directly to Jesus. Yeah, right. I suggested to Matt that he and his buddies just liked a good punch-up, that they just liked to fight. He didn't disagree. By the time I finally made it over to the gasworks, George had already gone home for the day. The nice lady in the office was kind enough to give George and Sadie's house a call, and not many minutes later, dear Cousin George was there to pick me up. Excuse me. Journal entry, Saturday, 7/10. Well, just like at my relatives in England, I'm being treated absolutely fantastic here in Ireland. Yesterday, George, May, and Winifred are two of George and Sadie's 5 kids, brought me out for a look at the country, and it's really beautiful. For the next several days, I had a chance to see much of Northern Ireland's spectacular countryside and unique sights, places like the Giant's Causeway, an amazing natural wonder along the northern coast of County Antrim. It's made up of about 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, the tallest nearly 40 feet high. The tops of the columns form stepping stones that lead from the cliff foot out to the sea. You really have to see it to believe it. In addition to having a chance to travel around a little, I also had an opportunity to work alongside George out in the peat fields. We cut and stacked bricks of peat moss, which were used in the home to heat and cook. We also brought in a couple trailer loads of the bricks that George had already cut and that were already dry. George pulled the trailer to and from the peat field and the barn with a wonderful old crank start tractor that amazingly was still up and running. I felt like I was participating in some genuine Irish culture. Another piece of Irish culture that I so thoroughly enjoyed and so genuinely miss is an evening out to the Irish pub. English and Irish pubs are such a unique experience and are unlike anywhere else in the world. George and Sadie were parents to Anne, May, Winifred, Barbara, and wee George. Barbara was married to Roy. Dear Roy definitely went out of his way to make sure that I had every opportunity to experience and enjoy the wonderful pubs in County Antrim and vicinity. What made an evening to the pub even more memorable was coming back home to George and Sadie's and enjoying a late-night hot cup of tea along with some kind of wonderful fresh-baked scone or biscuit or griddle bread or maybe even a little bite of each. So good. Journal entry continued, Saturday, 7:10. Barbara and Roy came over and we all went out to a local pub. I really had a great time. I even had the honor of meeting lovely Molly, the infamous barkeep at the pub. Molly was famous for, among other things, her rare and beautiful presentation of the swan dance, something I believe only a chosen few were given the honor of experiencing. She didn't grace us with a dance that night, but fortunately, this would not be my only visit to Sweet Molly's. Journal entry 717. I'm now at Bessie and Henry's house. Wednesday I helped George collect a couple trailer loads of peat from the field. We had quite a day of it. This trip is really fantastic. Thank you, Lord, very much. First of all, we got stuck in the moss for about an hour. Then when we got home again, the tractor wouldn't start. And then when it started, it quit on our way back to the field. That evening, we came here to Bessie's. Their children are Tilly, who is in London working for the embassy, Alfie, who is here doing more work than I ever want to, Emma and Melva. Friday, I worked with Henry, Alfie, and a guy named Wally, bringing in the hay. Today, I also brought in the hay. I don't think I could be a farmer because I wouldn't want to work every day as hard as I have the last two. Not only did I have the privilege of staying with George and Sadie, but I was also invited to spend some time on the dairy farm belonging to cousin Bessie and her husband Henry. Bessie was sister to Em, May, and Sadie. Bessie was also, by the way, named after my grandma Bessie. I ended up spending about a week at Bessie and Henry's and was able to have one more opportunity to bring in the hay. I also had an opportunity to see why I would never choose to own a dairy farm. What an unbelievable amount of work. All day, every day, forever and ever. Amen. Cousin Alfie was the one and only son to Bessie and Henry. As such, it was a given that he would be inheriting the farm. I remember asking Alfie if he really wanted to be a farmer and felt a little bad for him when he responded, "It's all that I know how to do." I was hoping that Alfie really loved to be a dairy farmer because if you didn't, it would be really, really hard. I was almost surprised that he even found the time to take a rest on Sunday, although it was pretty much just long enough to go to church. The cows had to be milked twice a day. Journal entry, Sunday, 7/18. Well, today, Henry, Bessie, and I went for a drive around the area. First, however, I went to church with Alfie and Emma. Alfie locked his keys in the car, so it was quite comical after church to see about 12 men trying to open the door with their keys. I gave them a hand with a piece of wire and opened the door. Always was pretty good with a coat hanger. During our drive, we went to Oatlands, the house where Grandma Bessie, or Grandma Sharp, who was Bessie, was brought up. I'd heard stories from cousin Sadie about how she remembered attending large party at Oatlands as a child, sitting on the staircase with the other kids and watching the guests coming around the circular drive by horse-drawn carriage and being dropped off. I could imagine it being a pretty grand place in its day. At the time of my visit, it was a working farm, and the owner was kind enough to allow me to have a little look around on the inside. There was something very cool about being able to visit the house where your grandmother grew up in Ireland. Over the years to come, I'd have a couple more opportunities to visit Oatlands, once with my parents and then also with my wife and kids. Journal entry, Sunday, 7/25. Well, on Monday, the 19th, we finished up with the hay that was ready, and that evening, Bessie and Henry brought me to George and Sadie's. Saturday evening, Barbara and Roy brought me to their friends named Ken and Roberta. Ken had some moonshine, or poachine, made by his friend Fred, and I had a glass. It smelled a little like a doctor's office, but I didn't think it tasted bad. Roy, on the other hand, thought it was awful. We then went to a pub and managed to get quite messy. Only the boys, mind you. Fred played his flute on stage and was very good. As was often the case in an Irish pub, there was traditional Irish music being played that night. It just so happened Fred was one of the great musicians performing. In addition to being a skilled poaching distiller and a great flute player, Fred was also known to make very special walking sticks out of black hawthorn. On our way home after closing the pub down, we all stopped by Fred's place where I was presented with one of his wooden creations. He'd taken a branch from a black hawthorn bush and apparently soaked the head of it in rutabaga juice. That's what I was told, really. Until it became pliable. He then formed that part of the stick into what looked like a duck's head. The little walking stick traveled with me into several countries and remains one of my prized possessions today. And I just happen to have it sitting right here. So here's this little walking stick with the duck head top. It is kind of cool. So, and it's black hawthorn. All right. Journal entry, Friday, 7:30. Hello again. Well, it's now Friday, and I've ended up staying here at George and Sadie's a little longer than I expected. Monday, I helped with Pete a little, and that was about all. Tuesday, George Jr. and I painted some and later went to the peat field. Cutting and collecting the dried peat bricks was a pretty important part of life for a family that depended on them for fuel. The next few days were pretty much the same until last night, Thursday, excuse me, when Barbara and Roy brought me out. We went out of town to a couple of places, both of which turned out to be closed. We then made a mad dash to try and get to Molly's before she closed. We raced and got there just before 11. As it turned out, we didn't need to fear her closing at all. Among the people there were the chief of the CID, Criminal Investigation Department, one of his detectives, and the detective's friend, who was the champion bagpipe player of Ireland. That's what I was told. It was fantastic. Both the detective and his friend played the pipes while Molly and some others, including the chief, danced. It was really a lot of fun. It was pretty hilarious to see the chief get more and more loosened up throughout the night and watch him trying to dance with my lovely cousin Barbara, who was very pregnant at the time. Barbara, who was not imbibing due to her delicate condition, was a great sport and even graced the well-primed chief of the CID with a dance. And speaking of dance, sweet Molly did not disappoint. I'm privileged to say that on this very special night, I witnessed her rare and beautiful swan dance. Thank you, Molly. Journal entry, Sunday, 8/1. The time I spent at George and Sadie's in Northern Ireland in all has been fantastic. Today, though, Barbara and Roy and May and I came down into the south with Greg, Ann, and Winifred behind us. We came down in 2 cars. I'm now near the town called Sligo. I was let out very near a big waterfall and am now staying just up a hill beside it. It's really a beautiful place, and I just hope I don't get too wet because it's been raining. Things are really too good to be true, and I really thank the Lord for it. Journal entry, Monday, 8/2. It's now about 12:30 in the afternoon of the 2nd. After getting up this morning, I picked up and headed for Sligo. That was around 10, and I made it about a mile down the road. It's pouring down rain, and I'm inside what looks to be an old mill of some kind. Hopefully the rain will stop soon, and I'll be on my way. After looking around, I'd say this building wasn't a mill, but possibly a coal or iron works. Journal entry, Wednesday, 8/4. Well, I finally made it into Sligo and went just a few miles outside of town when I stopped for the night. The next day, yesterday, I went into a little shop to pick up a few things and ended up getting a ride from a guy who was selling confections. He brought me into Ballina with a few stops on the way. After Ballina, I was picked up by a really nice couple named Patty and Philip. They were on their way to Castlebar for Patty to get a checkup because she's due to have a baby in a couple weeks. Well, Phil and I had some pints while we waited for Patty, and then we went on to Westport. Philip is a policeman, and 2 days ago he went on a big raid of an IRA camp in the middle of nowhere outside Westport. We went and looked at the place where it was, and it was really pretty incredible to be able to see this. Well, after leaving the place, they decided to bring me all the way to Auchel. On the way, we picked up two more hitchhikers named Rita and Ann. We all then went to Kiel on the island and stopped for a couple pints. I hope Philip and Patty make it home okay because we had more than a couple. Philip and Patty were such incredibly kind people and couldn't have been nicer to me. It became very clear, however, after Philip and I enjoyed some pints while Patty was at her appointment with the obstetrician, that alcohol caused him to lose any sense of how fast is too fast when driving. On the road to Auchel Island, we were going very, very fast on roads that were way too narrow and way too windy, and way too dangerous to be driving really, really fast on. Lovely Rita and Ann and I were all more than ready to reach our destination of Kiel on Auchel Island and get out of the car. Looking back, I wonder if Patty, who hadn't been doing any drinking of alcohol, was someone who just never drank, or if she was a little ahead of her time when considering possible problems with drinking alcohol while pregnant. I don't think it was until 1981 that the Surgeon General began warning women about drinking alcohol during pregnancy. Whatever the case, I just hope that she was the designated driver when they finally started for home. After we finally left the pub, I offered my tent to Ann and Rita, and that's where they are. Or that's where they slept, actually. Traveling with a tent on your back would prove to be a pretty great way to get around without having to worry so much about where you were going to sleep that night. It could be set up pretty quickly and just about anywhere that didn't cause the landowner a lot of grief. And not only did it provide me with a place to stay, but on several occasions I was given the opportunity to share my little shelter with new friends who were also needing a place to stay for the night. As mentioned, it could be set up just about anywhere. On this occasion, I chose a field not too far from the pub and just off the village road. Everything was fine until quite early the next morning when we had cows stepping on the corners of the tent and trying to poke their heads into the door. They may have been being coaxed on by the farmer who was just outside and who was making it pretty clear that he didn't appreciate my choice of campsites. Oh well, lesson learned. Sort of. This wouldn't be the only time I would need to quickly pack up and vacate a location. Auchel is the largest island off the west coast of Ireland, and I had heard that it would be a good place to enjoy some traditional Irish music. After that first night in Kiel, I found a nice secluded little spot next to a big bog lake where I could enjoy a lakeside campsite with a place to bathe and still be close to a local hotel pub with lots of guests also enjoying some vacation time on the island. Because the bottom of the lake where I stayed was peat moss, the water was almost black to look at. When bathing or paddling around in the water, I sometimes wondered a little if some cousin to the Loch Ness Monster was going to have me for lunch. In addition to this little lakeside resort, I also spent some time camping on the coast near the village of Duega. I think it was while listening to some traditional music at the pub in Duega that I noticed how many old guys had yellow fingers from cupping their cigarettes. I must say that it was such a huge surprise to me when in 2004, Ireland became the first country in the world to ban smoking in closed public spaces. Really did. I couldn't believe it. When thinking about Irish pubs, I can't help but remember the pints of Guinness and cider, the wonderful traditional Irish music, and the cigarette smoke. Truth is, I even started to roll my own during that phase of life. Journal entry, Saturday, 8:14. From Achill Island, I headed for Killorglin and the Puck Fair. Made it to Galway the first night, where I met some people from Dublin. They were Lowell, Patty, and their 3 children. I was very happy to meet them because they ended up picking me up again in Clare when I wasn't getting any rides. My first really bad thing happened this day because when I was trying to tying my pack on their car, I set my hat down and then forgot it. I didn't care about losing the hat, but I really felt awful about losing the Mizpah pin that Mom had given me. They brought me to the Shannon Ferry. One of the many beautiful natural features that you see when traveling down the west coast of Ireland are the wild fuchsia bushes which line the coastal roads. Unfortunately, when Lowell and Patty picked me up in County Clare, I set my hat on one of these lovely hedges but forgot all about it until we were several miles away, too far away to go back. Mizpah is a Hebrew word that's associated with a phrase found in Genesis 31:49 where it says, "The Lord watched between me and thee while we are absent one from another." I believe the pin had originally belonged to Grandma Bessie. She gave it to my mother, who in turn gave it to me. My brother Pat had also worn the pin during his travel adventures. I can only hope that it went to a good home. I also hope that the hat went to a good home because it was just so very cool. Well, actually, I just made that line up. Here's what it reads. Although it didn't, I can only hope that it went to a good home. I also hope that the hat, which the pin was attached to, also made it to a good home. Although it didn't have the sentimental value of the pin, it had been made by a wonderful old Greek hatter that used to have a shop in downtown Tacoma. It was cool. After taking the ferry across the Shannon River and going from County Clare to County Kerry, I finally made it to Killorglin. Killorglin was home to the Puck Fair, or Fair of the He-Goat, one of Ireland's oldest fairs and a great place to hear traditional music. I was blessed to hear so much wonderful music in Ireland that I almost feel a little guilty, but not too bad. What makes the Puck Fair a little more than just an excuse for 3 days of beer and music is that the reigning king of the fair is a goat. A goat catcher goes up into the mountains where he, or perhaps she, catches a wild goat and brings it back to the village where it's crowned King Puck. Some say that the Puck Fair is the oldest fair in all of Ireland. It can apparently officially be traced back to 1603, when King James I issued a charter granting legal status to the existing fair in Killorglin. Another little something about the fair that makes it even more unique, and that doesn't set real well with animal rights activists, is that King Puck reigns over the festivities from atop a caged pedestal that's raised about 60 feet in the air. I got the impression that with the exception of having to witness all the drunken antics going on below, it wasn't such a bad gig. The good king seemed to be treated very well and probably enjoyed a much better diet, at least for a few days, than most any other wild goat on the Emerald Isle. While enjoying the music, beer, and overall festivities of the Puck Fair, I became friends with a group of people who had come over from Brittany. Brittany is located in northwest France and is bordered by the Bay of Biscay on the south, the English Channel to the north, and the Celtic Sea and Atlantic Ocean to the west. Although Ireland and Scotland were pretty much the only places that came to my mind when thinking of Celtic music and language, it turns out the Celts apparently dominated much of Western and Central Europe in the first millennium BC. As a result, they brought their language and customs along with them. Even today, in addition to French, the Celtic language Breton is still spoken in Brittany. And where there is Celtic language, it only makes sense there would be Celtic music. My new friends from France had also come to enjoy the great music to be found at the Puck Fair. Journal entry continued, Saturday, 8/14. Well, I finally got to Killorglin. I met some people from France, Brittany rather. They are Hervé, Elizabeth, Brigitte, Henry, Jean-Pierre, and Pascal. They were really nice, and I will be meeting Hervé, Elizabeth, and Brigitte and Henry on the 21st or 23rd and going to Brittany with them. They invited me to Hervé's sister's wedding. I left on Friday and came here to Dingle, and that's where I am now. It's really beautiful country. Today I've moved my tent to a really beautiful place along the water. Last night was really great because when I went to bed, there was someone in a tent nearby playing folk music on a fiddle. Things are really going great. Dingle is a wonderful little village found on the westernmost point of southern Ireland on the Dingle Peninsula. I would so encourage anyone visiting Ireland to try to make a stop at this incredibly beautiful part of the country. Not only was the scenery magnificent, but there was also more wonderful Irish music to be found. One evening, I accompanied some newfound friends to a local pub where we stumbled into an impromptu Irish music jam session that, so we were told, included a couple guys from what was becoming a popular Irish folk group, the Fury Brothers. After closing down the pub, just about the whole place headed to the beach for a bonfire. Journal entry, Saturday, 8/21. During my stay in Dingle, I became good friends with two brothers named Martin and Lance. Also Lance's girlfriend, Anne. I also met up with two Germans named Martin and Andre. We all had one really good night last Sunday when we had a big fire on the beach with about 40 other people. There were also some beautiful girls from Dublin camping nearby, and I had a nice swim in a nearby pool with one named Fiona. Near to where we were camping, there was a beachside guest house that had an outdoor pool. Lovely Fiona and I were able to enjoy a clandestine middle-of-the-night dip in their pool. However, I can still remember the water being so cold that my teeth were chattering. Well, I left Dingle on Tuesday and made it to Cork. I stayed in the hostel for 2 nights and visited with Lance and Anne both nights because they live in Cork. Thursday, I got a lift from a really fantastic guy named Lynn, and he brought me to his parents' house where he, his wife Mary, and their 2 children are staying for the summer. They are really great people, and I ended up pitching my tent in their backyard. Ruka! Ruka! Ruka's over there dreaming on the couch right now. Lynn and Mary even brought me out for a movie. I left yesterday and made it here to Rosslare last night. I had a bit of a shocking experience yesterday when I got a lift from a Catholic priest. Up to this point, I had hitchhiked several hundred miles throughout England, Scotland, and Ireland and met many wonderful people along the way. My ride from a Catholic priest, however, although it got me a few miles closer to my destination, turned out to be a strange one for sure. Long story short, this man of the cloth tried to put his hand down my pants. Actually, while telling me how fit I looked, he tried to slip his hand in my bib overalls. Hey, I get it. A young, shirtless, tan, sinewy American boy wearing old bib overalls. How was this dedicated servant of the Lord to be expected not to act like a creepy old pervert? I wasn't sure whether to punch him in the throat or what. Although that was my first thought, I figured since he was driving, it probably wasn't the best plan, so I simply told him to pull over now. He did. No question, it was a pretty weird experience to be hit on by a Catholic priest. Probably most troubling was that here I was, a young seeker, who would have truly appreciated and could have benefited from a heartfelt conversation about things that matter. It made me wonder how many people had come to this, most likely, very respected so-called man of God in search of spiritual counsel, and instead encountered someone with something very different than their spiritual well-being on his mind. I must admit that this very unexpected encounter did significantly skew the Father Flanagan image I have of what an Irish Catholic priest should look like. That concludes Chapter 6, Emerald Isle. Next time, we'll be looking at probably just one chapter, Chapter 7, entitled The Vendage. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope this might be enjoyable to a few of you. And if it is, well, I know there's people that like to listen to books rather than read them. So if you're one of those, hope you enjoy this. Bye-bye for now. We'll see you next time.